I chase things, still I fear the answer's no. In this fucked up world in which I feel I stand alone. All this hate that I feel for you, my one true enemy, once was blind, but now I see. It makes me question, why do we choose to live this way? I try to free my mind from what's not meant to be. It makes me question why.
I feel like we've been here before. Have we been here before? Right, about this time last year, roughly, I covered the first Dead Space, much to many people's frustration. You see, I did a lot of comparing between the first Dead Space and this other game, you see, that will go nameless right now. And a lot of people seem to have a problem with that. And honestly, I don't know why. What is the deal with the idea that you can't compare things to those, especially when it's clear that one thing took a gajillion bits of influence from the other thing? Like, what's wrong with that? And yes, I know, in my first Dead Space review, I said that I had a ton of trouble enjoying the game because I felt like it had ripped off System Shock 2, okay? Let's just get over that right now. And yeah, I did, but it was still a really solid game, it just completely ripped off another game. But a lot of games do that. That's very normal. Let's be honest about this. And to say that a game is bad because of that, it really isn't fair. I mean, yeah, when they rip off a game wholesale, it's a problem, but I don't really think Dead Space ripped off System Shock 2 wholesale. If we weren't operating by that logic, it would have ripped off the, you know, technical aspects and the first-person view and everything else, really. But it didn't. It still tried to do something on its own. I mean, it had a few original ideas. It took more influence from The Thing in terms of the Necromorphs, to be honest. They're more like that than the many, if we really want to get thorough. And on its own, Dead Space was still a creepy experience, and probably a breath of fresh air into the survival horror genre. Even though I felt it was a bit more action-y than most survival horror games, it still knew what it was trying to do. Yet still people got really mad about this. Yes, how dare I compare Dead Space to System Shock 2, one of the greatest survival horror games ever made in the sci-fi genre. I mean, what would be bad about that? That's wonderful. Like, it's not like I'm calling it another Resident Evil clone, because it is a lot like RE4 in that regard. I mean, I could have said that and been done with it, but instead of pointing out influences from what I would argue to be a far superior game when compared to, say, Resident Evil. I'm not saying Resident Evil is bad, please don't get on me about that. God, I'm just digging myself deeper, aren't I? Listen, let's talk about Dead Space 2. Because I wasn't really sure how I was going to feel about Dead Space 2, because again, I did have an issue getting into Dead Space 1, because I felt like it was a lot like System Shock. And again, the whole time I was like, well, this is good, but I'd rather be playing System Shock. Dead Space 2, I'm happy to report, does not have this problem. It's actually pretty good on its own. It is not really taking that much from System Shock 2 anymore. It's taking a bit more from System Shock 1. Okay, that's not fair. About the only thing it takes from System Shock 1 is the setting, which is on a space station, and that's literally it. Okay, everything else is just Dead Space 2, so that was a joke. Don't get on me about that. Laugh. Enjoy life. You don't have to brood in your Dead Space and just be like, yes, nobody questioned my Dead Space. It's perfect in every conceivable way, and there's no way it could possibly rip anything else off. It's original, even though it's like everything else. That's what you sound like to me. That's what happens when I read the comments. I imagine you looking like that. So, can we just avoid the subject entirely now? Now that we've had this discussion, is that alright with you? Because I actually really like Dead Space 2. And I was just as surprised as you are, because I wasn't really sure, but I had heard Dead Space 2 took the first game and made it better, so I was hopeful And I'm glad I was, because Dead Space 2 is actually a really, really good game. It does what it does, and it does what it's trying to do very well. I'd go into more details, but to be perfectly frank, there isn't all that much different from the first game. It's just more refined. I think the action elements are flushed out more here, which doesn't exactly surprise me, considering what little I know about Dead Space 3. So there's sort of a natural progression going on here. And I did feel like the game was trying to be a bit more streamlined and not really trying to be as survival horror-y with it. It still is, it still has those elements, but not nearly as strongly as the first game. And again, what is the deal with survival horror games doing that? Like, you start out with your straight-up survival horror experience, and like there's this slow progression into just outright action. Resident Evil, Dead Space, Silent Hill to a certain extent. They all do this, and I don't really understand why. Maybe because the more actiony games sell better, but I think what devs really need to know is that if you're gonna do that, if you're gonna have some action in your survival horror experience, it needs to be balanced like it is right here. I think Dead Space 2 is actually the sweet spot for trying to balance out survival horror aspects and action. It's a little bit of both, all rolled into one, and I think the balance is perfect. Because it's still pretty scary. I mean, the horror aspects are still there. There were plenty of times where, you know, a jump scare got me or something, but even without the jump scares, just the idea of what's going on is terrifying, because the first Dead Space had the necromorph infestation, yes, but you showed up after it already happened. You didn't see it in progress. It was already there. Here, you get to see it as it's happening, which I would argue is way more fucking freaky. Particularly when you get to certain points of the game and all of a sudden, really just unnecessarily freaky shit starts to happen.
Did you honestly think you could go on like this? You can't just walk into the darkness and then walk right out, you know.
Shut up! You're not real!
It stays. You can't escape it. You can't escape yourself. You know it was all your fault. Don't you remember?
Did it?
Remember what happened? Remember where they went? It was all because of you.
What the hell was that?
It was nothing. Let's just move on, shall we? The game is really freaky. Quite often, in fact. To be honest, it shows basically no restraint with freaking you out. I gotta be honest with you. It really does hammer home what's going on, and no demographic is safe from this problem. As for the story itself, it's pretty good. I really like the supporting cast, mainly Ellie. Ellie is the shit. I love this chick. Okay, she's awesome. So I just needed to know that. No, I'm not gonna flirt with her. I don't really feel like dealing with that after what just happened a moment ago. As for the gameplay, well, as I already said, it is very much the same as the first Dead Space, it's just more streamlined. You have plenty of different weapons and different suits to pick from, therefore your options are actually quite expansive. You can play the game in multiple different ways and rely on very specific weapons if you want, or have a more broad spectrum of choices. It really depends on what you want to do. And I think that's really good for it. It means there's different options and more replay value in that regard. There's multiple different kinds of necromorphs, all of which have to be taken on in a different manner. You can't just go around blasting everything unless, of course, you're on the easiest difficulty, in which case you can absolutely do that. But anything higher than that, and then you actually have to think, which I like. I like the fact that all the enemies aren't the same, and you actually have to think about how to approach them. It's not just a run and gun situation. Not that the first Dead Space was like that either, but I felt like with the new variety of necromorphs added to the game, it made decision-making a bit more difficult. You had to really decide how you were going to handle different situations. And the necromorphs have to take you by surprise, so you have to think very quickly. You don't get time to just plan, you have to just go and hope you pick the correct choice of action. It's mostly about where to shoot them, since, again, it's all about delimbing, which I still can't get over that, because it's like the exact opposite of what you would do in any other game. Usually when you're, hitting someone's limbs, you're just messing around in like any other shooter. But here, it's all about that. Headshots just usually don't work. Even if you take off their head, it doesn't work. That's not how necromorphs are. They're not like zombies, where if you take the head off, you're fine. It's the exact opposite situation. It's all about ripping them apart, because you have to make sure they can't move anymore, because they're kind of like the Thing. They can keep going even if you rip them to pieces. That kind of a unique enemy type, I think, makes the Dead Space franchise a bit distinctive just because of what you're having to deal with. It's not like a lot of other games in that regard. And this is something I probably should have admitted in the first review, and I'll admit that maybe I should have mentioned it, because System Shock 2 wasn't like that at all. It was really about just shooting everything. You had different enemy types there too, but I can't think of a single one that involved disemboweling them. You just had to shoot them and hope for the best. Or you could be stealthy. It's a stealth game too, but there were different options in System Shock 2. It was a different game. I'm not gonna sit here and act like it wasn't. Oh shit, and I completely forgot to talk about graphics and sound, because I usually talk about those first. Visuals are a bit better than the first Dead Space, not, leaps and bounds, but it looks really good, and actually holds up pretty well considering how old the game is now. And the score is just freaking awesome. The music perfectly complements the game, and I think that's something you really need in a survival horror experience. You need a solid musical score to combat what's happening around you, and Dead Space 2 nails that aspect perfectly. Now this is the point you're going to want me to talk about negatives, but to be perfectly frank, I don't have that many of them. My only major complaint with Dead Space 2 are the puzzles. And there are puzzles in the game adding to the survival horror idea. And there are a couple times where the puzzles are actually really interesting, and they actually require just a little bit of thought. But most of the time, it's just about put A into B. End of story. Some of these are just the most brain-dead puzzles you can possibly imagine. There's no thinking. It's mostly about not even finding. Everything's right in front of you. You just gotta put it into place. There are a couple puzzles that were pretty good though, and I liked them, but most of them are just busy work. And every time it happened, I felt like the game was just kind of grinding its gears. It just wasn't moving. It would screech to a halt and force you to unlock a stupid door that really didn't involve any intellectual prowess. It just served to waste your fucking time. And the game loves to do this thing where the door in front of you that you're supposed to go through won't open until you defeat all the necromorphs. And I think that's just fucking annoying, because there's no logical reason why the door would be like that. I mean, they tried to bring it up by saying, oh, the other room's depressurizing, or there's just a convenient door malfunction that somehow goes away as soon as you kill the necromorphs. I mean, it's just little shit like that, just to hold you off to make sure you don't get through the game too quickly. The worst part is the game isn't all that long, so it's not like these bits really help. I see why they put them in, but if this kind of thing is a problem, why not just make the game longer? Okay, maybe that requires more development time, alright, that's not a dumb thing, but I just hate it when games put artificial barriers in front of you. And Dead Space 2 does that all the fucking time. But on the flip side, you have to point out that that's the only real issue I have with the game. And considering that means it's mostly a solid experience, and I'm very happy I got the excuse to finally play this game. So thank you to the person who requested it. Until next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.